Ladies and gentlemen, dear State Secretary Brandner, let me warmly welcome you to our online conference, TBI Meets TTC. The second ministerial meeting of the EU-US Trade and Technology Council will be taking place in France in just a few days. The TBI took this meeting as an opportunity to discuss our recommendations for transatlantic cooperation. You can find them in the TBI papers published in February, with representatives from the two sides, the European Union and the United States. I am very happy that delegates directly involved in the TTC working groups will be among the discussions today. I'm looking forward to 4 compact panel discussions, precisely 25 minutes each, moderated by TBI representatives on trade, on climate, on digital, and on finance issues that the TTC deals with. I had the opportunity and privilege to travel to Washington in the last week of April, together with colleagues from the other associations supporting the TBI. We met with representatives of the US government and American business, for example, at the US Department of Commerce, the Department of State, or the Office of the US Trade Representative. The delegation also met members of Congress from the Congressional Study Group on Germany, as well as business representatives from German and American companies. In our talks, we promoted pragmatism and realism in German-American trade policy and the strengthening of the transatlantic economic area. The current geopolitical realities show clearly that an even closer transatlantic relationship and cooperation is needed. In the short term, for ending the war in Ukraine, and in general for dealing with autocratic systems and for shaping the new world order. These were good talks that frankly encouraged me. Now we must make even greater use of the TTC, which got off to a promising start last year to discuss important issues for the future. For example, a transatlantic agreement on industrial tariffs and the mutual recognition of conformity assessments is urgently needed. And in general, businesses should be more closely involved in the TTC. To make progress on key security and climate issues and to defend our free democratic values, there is no way around a genuine comeback of transatlantic economic relations. There is no shortage of topics for policymakers to discuss at the next TTC ministerial. Above all, Russia's war on Ukraine will certainly dominate the discussions, not only in the 10 working groups that were formed last year. The war has also put additional points on the agenda, such as the coordination on state-backed information manipulation and disinformation. We have heard that the two sides plan to create a joint crisis mechanism to share social media data and insights in times of conflict, as well as an information sharing mechanism to check that Russia does not violate sanctions. There will be also discussions on further export controls on emerging technologies. Much is also to be done in other areas, such as transatlantic coordination on global standard setting or supply chain resilience. Ladies and gentlemen, the future success of the TTC is not a given. Both sides must work resolutely towards concrete results. And now, without further ado, let me pass the word to Parliamentary State Secretary Franziska Brandner at the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Actions for a perspective of the German government on the TTC. Ms. Brandner, we are delighted to have you here today, and the floor is yours. Well, some technicalities. Even after 2 years of pandemic, we obviously still struggle with connectivity. Here she is. Mrs. Brandner, a warm welcome. Happy to have you here. And we are looking forward to your statement, your introduction to our exercise as of today. Thank you.
Dear. Yes, thank you very much for having invited me. It's a pleasure for me to be here together with you. I'm speaking to you from the Bundestag because we have a plenary session this week. And that's why I do have this not ministerial background, but just Bundestag background. I think that the Transatlantic Business Initiative is these days even more important than when it was created. And you know that we had one big elephant in the room, which was part of creating the TTC, and that was China. And it still remains very relevant. But of course, we have now another very important reason and challenge that we have to deal with transatlantically, and that's the war, the terrible war on Ukraine. And I think that this also gives us economic challenges that we transatlantically have to overcome. And it's clear that we can do this much better if we do it together. So I'm glad that we have you as the business communities having your dialogue and that really at a good time and at the right time, and to get your expertise, your understanding, your insights into our conversations. You know that we have decided in Germany to have the Zeitenwende, to have a change of paradigm in our politics, and that also applies to our geopolitics, our geoeconomics. And that's why we need to work much more together with our democratic partners. And I think that we have seen over the last couple of years, especially during the Trump also administration, there are very unproductive transatlantic difficulties, if you don't want to say fights. And I hope that we will never allow ourselves to go down into such unproductive fights again, because actually we don't have the energy and time for having such infights. We have to focus our energy on advancing our innovation, our joint understanding, our economic well-being, and making sure that we do advance together. And I think that's why we're so happy that we have a new administration that we can solve problems with, and that we have to use that time at best. And that's why for us the TTC is very important. And you might know that the joint statement is much more hands-on this time. It's a work agenda. And there are 2 points in there, of course, that are important, where it goes into quite detail, which is one is the question of supply chains. And there it really foresees a joint transatlantic agenda with concrete steps. And I think it's very welcome that we have this joint approach. Second, is also important on standardization norms, where it also decides that we want to go together in a strategic way. So, instead of talking about the status quo, we do create new dynamics. And I think that's what is important. And we do give new impulses to our transatlantic trade relationship. And of course, there are difficult issues as well. I don't want to hide them, but I think that we are also going well there when it comes to artificial intelligence, setting joint standards, also on other technological markets. We have now the DMA, DSA, and I think that this also opens a new opportunity now to have a cooperation and see where our American partners will go themselves when it comes to regulation. In the US, the antitrust policies are key to that in the US. So I think it is, a lot of good work happening, much behind the scene, but on the other side, it's really concrete work. And we do support this from our side very much so, and are very glad that we have this joint work with our partners. And we have one precise thing that I also would like to speak about. It's the chip sector, where we have now a lot of investments on both sides of the Atlantic, where we also have joint corporations where we do together want to retain production capacity and innovation capacity in Europe, in the United States, and that we do set also a legal framework for this and work together. And I think that we will hopefully get into more sectors like this, that we will jointly define how we proceed, batteries, solar, in many areas where I think we can work together. I still look forward to a complete abolishment of the US, steel and aluminium duties. I hope that we will soon agree on the global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminium. That's for us important. It might also be a first step of sort of a small, instead of a CBAM, to have there a joint approach on decarbonized or at least, sustainable steel and aluminium. We do set quite high hopes in this process, and hope that we will create a level playing field here that is also sustainable for us in the long run. And allow me at the end to say that we haven't given up on the WTO, and we still look forward to modernizing it as far as we can together with the US. But that in the meantime, when we see that it's not possible to reform it, we have to rely on also our bilateral trade and our tools, reinforce them so that we can have fair play, fair trade, and that our businesses do not lose out. And I think that's the joint understanding: invest together in innovation, make sure that we are resilient, and that we do maneuver well through these geopolitically difficult times. And I'm very grateful for you for organizing this, for bringing the two sides together, investing your time, energy, and expertise. And I'm looking forward to future exchanges. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Brandner, for your comments, your words, which were both encouraging, motivational, and tangible, and not hiding away from the difficult subjects we have to address. With that, I would like to hand over to our first panel on trade and investment policy, and it will be chaired and moderated by Max Krawinkel, the CEO of PWM. Mr. Krawinkel, may I please ask you to take over?
Yes, many thanks. Since you were precisely asking for 25 minutes, I will do the intro very short of the panel speakers and myself. I'm the co-chair of the TBI in Trade and Investment chapter. Just a few words about the TBI. We were founded by the German industry and the related associations after the administration change in Washington, D.C., to revitalize the strong history of trade between the US and Germany. We are fully aware of Buy American policies, which are still alive in the Biden administration, but we think we need to, with this initiative, there are a lot of opportunities we would miss, and that's why we are wanting to re-establish this old relationship. Ms. Brandner was saying it's a Zeitenwende on the German part, so we are expecting or hoping for a Zeitenwende on the US part, that we get back and get lifted all the bans from the Trump administration. We have a parallel initiative, which is the TCC, and that's why we have this panel discussion now, to learn more about the TCC and also what we as TBI can contribute to the TCC. And we are happy that we could win 2 experts in this area. One is Mr. Rupert Schlegelmilch. He is really an expert in trade. Since '95, he is working in different leading positions on the EU level with trade with Asia, the ASEAN, and also the US. And then we have William Bill Tchaikovsky from the US Embassy. He has been in Berlin since '95. In between, he has been in Russia and Poland, and his title is 1 second. You are the Minister Council for Commercial Affairs. Mr. Schlegelmilch is the Deputy Director General for Trade at the EU. So, Mr. Schlegelmilch, we learned in the papers that next week in Paris will be between the EU and US a signing of some actions, and we are very interested to learn more details about it. So the word is to you.
Thank you very much. And let me start off by thanking you for having us here. Indeed, I'll be very brief. We will meet next week in Paris. You will get a 50 pages document which underscores the amount of work which has been done. Because we have 10 working groups under the TTC, which is trying to do exactly what you said, to re-establish a relationship which was in deep trouble, certainly on the trade side, during the last administration. And we're trying to re-establish a positive agenda through this dialogue platform, which I would call dialogue platform. It's not a trade negotiation, on many of the issues which are really relevant for us, for our citizens, for our businesses. And the point is, and I want to make that point, it is not a platform where we jointly work against someone, challenges from China or from Russia. That is part of the work, obviously, to safeguard our values and our interests. But it's also a platform to work with each other on a positive agenda between the deepest relationship we have in trade and investment, which is by far the EU-US relationship. So to make a strong story short, what we're going to talk about is tech standards. It was mentioned already, including setting up a standardization information mechanism on international standard developments. We're going to talk about climate and clean tech, including on methodology for CBAM, which we just talked about, carbon intensity. All these work starts with knowing what you talk about, what methodology you actually do to apply. Secure supply chains has started as an issue of dependency mainly on East Asia. Now it's a dependency also from Russia, which is under scrutiny. We have the Information Communication Technology Security Access, which is basically trying to also have safe networks, not only in the EU and the US, but also in third countries. And what can we help to actually have these networks in third countries through financial assistance as well. Data governance and platforms, I'll rest my case. DMA, DSA has been mentioned. We are talking about implementation issues here. It's not a conflict we have here, but a conflict, just to say that. Misuse of technology, cooperation of export control, investment screening, SME aspect, and global challenges on trade, which is basically how to deal with the non-market economies using the WTO, but also unilateral tools. Now, this whole list is, of course, then fed by detailed papers on what we're going to do to cooperate together. And I'll stop here because the point is not to go into all the details. The point is to show we have really established communication and having people in the same room on all these issues, including the difficult ones on digital governance, if you wish. And that has produced an enormous amount of paper, but it's also produced an enormous amount of understanding and daily contacts, which are vital if there is a crisis. One example, when the Russian invasion into Ukraine started, we had the right tools to talk about export controls and avoid something which our business always hated, which was extraterritorial legislation from one side, which then you had to follow in the EU and vice versa. So that is a good example of what this platform can do, and we will probably discuss more details soon, but I'll stop here, hoping that you will all then sift through the 50 pages and come up with more ideas on what to do with that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. When are these 50 pages available? Just to...
On Monday after the press conference.
Okay, so Mr. Tchaikovsky, did you read already the 50 pages? And if so, what's your take? And can we hope for a Zeitenwende on the US part too?
Well, I think there has been a Zeitenwende, or at least a change in perspective, if you will. I think a lot of what has already been mentioned by Herr Schlegelmilch and also with the State Secretary, Dr. Brunner, very well, is that a lot of this was predicated on a rebuilding of trust. You couldn't start the TTC process without having already gone through a couple of levels of trust building. I mean, just last year we had resolved a 17-year-old dispute between Boeing and Airbus. This predated the last administration. I think, as Herr Schlegelmilch put it so well, you know, there has been a drift, and you can't say that it was only the last couple of years. And I think we took advantage of the fact that we had this relationship for so many years between the EU and the United States, that we started to basically forget the importance of this relationship and how we had to foster it. I always say that sometimes you actually have to go out and trim the bushes a little bit. You know, you have to actually do a little work to make a relationship be fostered and maintained. And I think that drifted. I think the Airbus and Boeing agreement was good. The global minimum global tax deal that was negotiated, Chancellor Scholz was very, very central in that process in his earlier capacity as finance minister. I think it was already mentioned about the steel and aluminum agreement that hopefully we will see finalized. And maybe we'll actually see a creation of the world's first carbon-based sectoral agreement by 2024, which would be great. But we can't stop there. But it is important to have that as a basis for how we talk about TTC and how we should view it. Because it did not happen overnight. It didn't happen just because we are friends. It happened because we mutually recognized that there was a basis for trust. There was a basis for shared values and principles. And this is why we started the TTC. Now, if you remember, I hate to bring up sore subjects, especially when they were in the past, but the first instance, the first meeting in Pittsburgh in September of the Trade and Technology Council happened right at the same time as the AUKUS situation was unfolding. And there was talk that that would be something that would derail the TTC process. But it didn't, because there was a mutual a recognition that we needed to move forward. Now, I always hesitate to mention this, but I'll do it because I think it's important to be honest. Being a big supporter of free trade and what have you, I've had a long history fighting for TTIP. I was one of the TTIP warriors on the U.S. side, trying to get the passage of that. And in a sense, I'm delighted to see, you know, the greatest hits being replayed here in Europe. And there's a lot of talk about, can we revise or revitalize TTIP? I think it's mutually recognized that that's probably not the way to approach this. Doing something more incrementally, less political, more technical in nature, like the TTC, is the way to go forward on this. But we have to recognize the fact that I think we took advantage of the fact that we had the largest in the history of the United States. I'm sorry, in the history of the United States and Europe, the history of the planet, the largest trade relationship and economic relationship that this planet has ever seen, which is the transatlantic relationship, was not being fostered, was not being maintained, it was not being honored. And we had to reverse that course. And I think the TTC, when it was originally put forward, was a way of actually addressing some issues. I think I won't retread the same ground Herr Schlegelmilch has already done. The critical areas where we do expect some movement forward on standards recognition, on issues with regards to the standards development, emerging technologies, with regards to export controls, investment screening. And there's many different areas where I think we can expect some movement forward, because we're looking at these things in the TTC on a more technical basis and no longer at a more of a political basis, which is where it needs to be. And I do think, I think Herr Schlegelmilch already mentioned it, I do believe export sanctions that were put in place in reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a perfect example and a perfect early win in this process. we've had a long history of not syncing very well our export regimes, and here Schlegel put it better than I will. And I think we are actually at a point now where we have people, thanks to the TTC process, in the same room already. And they were already working on issues regarding how do we work together better on export controls. So the platform was already established and allowed us to move forward together in cooperation and in coordination with each other. I think that without the TTC, that would have been a little bit more clunky than it actually turned out to be. Now, before I stop talking and open it to questions, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the one thing that I think is one of the bases for TTC and maybe the new impetus for TTC and movement forward is the idea of combating autocratic regimes. I've read with great interest the latest op-ed written by Professor Russman yourself. A great piece of work, and I would agree with it wholeheartedly. How you framed the argument. I think one challenge that both our countries, the transatlantic relationship, has is how to shape our economic relationship to effectively engage with autocratic regimes. If you remember in the past, we used to unfortunately have this nomenclature filter into our discussions about decoupling. And I always felt that was such the wrong way to put it. And I think, once again, President Russman, you put it perfectly. It's not about decoupling. It's about being a little bit more realistic, a little bit more clear-headed in how we approach autocratic regimes. Putting a risk premium on dealing with these regimes, not trying to decouple from them. Of course, the sanctions regime is a completely different thing, and it's a completely different set of circumstances with regards to Russia than China and other places. But I think that is so important to keep that in mind. We're not looking to gang up on any markets. It's being very realistic. It's about raising our deep concerns about non-market practices, economic coercion, human rights abuses, etc. And that's the right way to approach this. I think that's going to be a singular focus of the TTC going forward. I would encourage that to be even further discussed. And last thing I'll mention, and I won't dwell on it because it's going to be a separate panel, is the importance of working together in certain areas. State Secretary also already mentioned semiconductors, but there's other areas that we need closer cooperation. I tend to focus on energy, but you're going to hear from my colleague in the embassy, Virginia Murray, in more depth on that topic. But these are areas that we need to work closer together on a transatlantic basis to ensure that we have a regime in place where we actually can address the needs and the issues confronting the transatlantic trading environment without having to rely or be dependent on, as one of our senators told us recently, we can't rely on the unreliable. So we have to get back to the point where we're actually relying on the reliable, which is the transatlantic relationship. So anyway, I'll stop talking there. Dr. Krawinkel, I will turn it back to you and be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Tchaikovsky. I think I have a question right away to Mr. Schlegelmilch, because Mr. Tchaikovsky was highlighting or saying it's important, the relationship management. So now we have a paper circulating, the TBI paper circulating on certain desk of political decision makers. So you know in detail the TBI paper and in detail the TTC paper. I guess there are a lot of overlaps. So how can we prevent that there's an overdoing on our side?
Well, I don't think that you can do too much on this relationship because, as we have heard, it needs constant nurturing. I think we need to be pushing into the same or working on the same issues in parallel and trying to synergize and reinforce what we are doing. And I'd like to single out, there are many issues we can single out, but the question of standards, which has been put front and center, because this is the request that I get quite a lot, in particular from the German industry. That needs political backing. So it has technical aspects, but without a political push, it's very difficult to get regulators cooperate on a higher level, if you wish. We've seen this in the past. And in particular, when it comes to emerging standards, you have to get the timing right before things gel on each side of the Atlantic. You have to have really upstream cooperation on the new technologies. I think this is important for both sides in order to have a bigger, if you wish, scaled up market and not have compatibilization via the standardization tools, which some other players are doing. But here we need, in particular, strong players in standards like the German industry. But we also need a political knowledge, a political push, because regulators themselves, and that includes the commission regulators, I can say that very frankly, are not necessarily looking outwards. They're looking inwards to regulate what they have to regulate from their mandate. So this is one point. If I may say one other point on the whole question of greening the economy, we need all the support we can get to get a good outcome on this pilot project on green steel, not only because steel has been an irritation for all of us for a long time because we were labeled in the EU side, or we were caught in this national security debate, but also because it will show whether it's possible to marry trade expansion, if you wish, or removal of barriers and a green agenda. Removing barriers is not exactly the prime topic that plays in the US, we have to be honest. The administration is trying to have a worker-centered trade policy, which is looking more at distributional effects and other things. Unionization and having trade would be, I think, more worker and environmental friendly. But for a transatlantic marketplace to function, I think we should not forget that we also want to make it as easy as possible within the transatlantic marketplace. This is where the standards and the green issues come in. And so those are the big, I think, themes which both papers have, and where I think we can really work together.
One question to you, one encouraging word from you, Mr. Tchaikovsky, to us, the German industry. How much is the TBI initiative leveled in the Biden administration?
It's a good question, and I'm reminded quite often a quote that was quoted to me just recently, and now I've heard it about 15 times. It's one of those things. The U.S. trade representative always said you can't engage Germany too much, and I would expand that out to the transatlantic relationship. But it is true. I think there is a recognition. I wouldn't say it's a new recognition. It's a revitalized recognition of the importance of this relationship, and I think that TBI has caught people's attention because you're actually putting together real recommendations. It's not just talk. You're actually formulating ideas and pushing them forward. So it really has gotten the attention of Washington. You know, we talk about Germany not only in the sense of trade and investment. Germany obviously is one of the largest trading partners of the United States. The soon to be the second largest investor, FDI investor in the United States. The United States, I think, is the first FDI investor in Germany. So there's this relationship that's very deep, but it goes beyond that. And I think we're trying to move beyond just those raw numbers. There are areas where I think we can learn from each other and develop with each other, things such as workforce development. There's a lot that I've been hearing from investors around the world, no matter where they invest, either in the United States, Germany, or abroad. There is an issue of skilled workforce and how to find the quantities that we currently need for larger investments. And I do say this is another area where I think Germany has a competitive advantage in a louder voice in Washington, because Washington does view German Dualausbildung and what you're doing here as a model. We're trying to move more and more toward reinforcing that in the United States. So for many reasons, TBI has has a moment to be influential, mainly because it is the crux of TBI is here in Germany, and Germany has that outsized voice in Washington amongst decision makers. So I think this is the perfect moment, and I congratulate Professor Rusworm for actually pushing this forward. Maybe back when it wasn't all that popular. Now it is a popular idea, but it's obviously a very timely moment for this discussion.
Okay, Mr. Schlegelmilch, any encouraging word to the German industry?
I always encourage the German industry because they're a very important ally in all of this work. And I think we have to, these are thick boards, as we say in German, dicke Bretter. So I think there is also stamina necessary to also convince the administration on all fronts that there is a trade agenda which includes opening markets. I mean, you mentioned Buy America in the beginning. We have to be honest to ourselves. Market access, increased market access is not necessarily the first priority for this administration. And we have to also make the case for open trade, including supporting the WTO, which is also in your paper. But like many issues, some things need to be said again and again. And sooner or later, I think we'll also see more outcomes. We have in the paper of the 50 pages, we also, the word conformity assessment and regulatory cooperation is there. So we have the basis for that in our approach as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So I go optimistic out of this panel discussion. I think even if it's a bad thing, the war in the Ukraine, it has shown us we are all sitting in one boat, especially the democratic countries, Germany and the US. We have done our Zeitenwende on the German part, and I think we know by history we have strong relationships, and I'm looking forward to revitalize them, and the German industry, of course, in total is looking forward to it. So many thanks for being with us today, and I would like to turn over to the next panel. It will be the data and digital economy, and it will be led by Mr. Schumacher from Infineon, and then also from Mr. Greiner from Telekom.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon and good morning to the East Coast. Semiconductors have been labeled the oil of the 21st century, and data has been called the gold of the 21st century. So while both semiconductors and data are really just small parts of the global economy, they are foundational. They're important to national security, to digitalization, to decarbonization. The semiconductors we look at as the link between the digital world and the real world, and the decisions on data reflect some fundamental values of how we think of ourselves as individuals or as societies. And as we have seen, they can also impact the stability of our democratic societies. So I'm grateful for the panel. We are grateful as a German industry that these topics play an important role in the TTC discussions, among others. And we are encouraged by some of the progress which has recently been made, both individually at the US and European level, and under the umbrella of the TTC. The semiconductor industry is also one of the most dynamic industries, and so I think it behooves us quite well that over the last 18 or so hours, we changed the participants to this panel 2 or 3 times, changed the format as well. And so I'd like to thank the BDI and Professor Rusworm for being flexible and supportive on that. I joked this morning, being flexible in responding to changing external stimulus is a sign of a resilient system, and that's certainly something which we are all looking for these days. Before I get a little bit then into the format, let me briefly introduce my co-host. Dr. Jakob Greiner is Vice President, European Affairs at Deutsche Telekom. And like Ivo Wollmann, who is Director Data at the Directorate General for Communications Networks, content and technology in the European Commission, experts on data policy, both on the European and on the transatlantic level. My name is Andreas Schumacher. I'm Executive Vice President for Strategy and M&A at Infineon Technologies, one of the leading global semiconductor manufacturers. And so the way we are going to structure this panel for lack of another semiconductor expert, I guess also somewhat befitting to the current situation, which is characterized by the lack of semiconductors. I will do an introduction on the semiconductor challenges, on what we as German industry have worked together in the framework of the TBI, of the BDI, to address some of those issues which we see, some of the opportunities on the Transatlantic Alliance. I will make a few comments on both the European Chip Act and the TTC discussions to the extent that we are aware of them. And I would then hand over to Mr. Greiner and Mr. Wollmann to, in a second part, look into the aspects of data and data policy. So, technological progress on semiconductors enables innovation in a broad range of industries. We know all that have experienced all that more and more in the recent month. This happens along value chain and is really fundamental and foundational to industrial ecosystems in Europe and in the US. The semiconductor value chain itself is amongst the most global of any industry, and no single country or region really holds the key to the entire value chain. Although there's been a trend over the last decades, especially on the manufacturing side, of some of those smallest feature size semiconductors in Asia, especially in Taiwan. So in light of those geopolitical tensions, of those interdependencies, the bottlenecks in the semiconductor industry have become very apparent, and also the center of political discussion over the last 18 months. In what I'm going to say, though, I believe it's important to differentiate between short-term supply-demand issues, which have been very painful for many industries over the last quarters, and fundamental long-term strategic issues, which include, for example, R&D facilities, IP, technological know-how, and very importantly, availability of a skilled workforce. I believe that in the long run, Europe and the US will lead and win in the semiconductor race through innovation and education, first and foremost. So, being a European, allow me to make 3 observations on the recently proposed European Chips Act currently being discussed, and then I'll turn to the TTC and some of the observations and opportunities there. First of all, I've mentioned that already, strengthening the European talent pipeline. The European Chips Act aims to address this acute skill shortage, but that skill shortage didn't happen overnight. It has built up over many, many years. It's just become more business critical. So not only the semiconductor industry, but also the technology industry in Europe in general is experiencing a lengthy, what we'd call time to hire process due to a lack of skilled engineers. And in order to become more competitive as Europe in this global landscape, we should urgently address this need for more digital and engineering talent in this area. Second point I want to make about the European Chips Act is that it's proposing a rather complex governance structure. At least that's the way I look at it. The Chips Act proposes various bodies, such as a European Semiconductor Board with subgroups, a semiconductor committee, the European Chips Infrastructure Consortium, national single points of contacts, and national competent authorities. it sounds a bit complicated, and we look forward to clarification on what those bodies will eventually do, what the industry will be invited to contribute to this consortia, and how this can be made efficient and effective. And finally, probably under the influence of the recent crisis, the CHIP Act alludes various times to crises, to disruptions, crisis stages, and proposes that public authorities and the above-mentioned bodies have fairly far-reaching competencies like information gathering, common purchasing, priority-rated orders, export bans, and penalties to impact the open market. There too, we propose that perhaps coming up with contingency plans, aligned contingency plans ahead of the rainy day might be the better approach between the European Commission, the member states, industrial players, research organizations, and those should be put in place before it starts to rain and avoid too much of a reaching into the market balance during a time of crisis already. Now, I'd like to briefly turn to the TTC discussions, and you will realize that much of what I mentioned about the European Chips Act also comes up there. Also, the the TTC discussions seem to relatively broadly focus on supply-demand imbalances, but they don't, at this point, to the extent that we know that, acknowledge how semiconductors are really foundational to these very different ecosystems, technology ecosystems in the US and Europe. Europe's industries have different strength than American industries. Both are unique, and we believe that appreciating those differences and strengthening the US and European ecosystems in the end will lead to better outcome, more cooperation by strengthening the strength rather than a race for subsidies, and in the end then competition in areas where each nation or each region has its unique strength. So we look forward to perhaps more clarification there from the TTC. Second point, I'm just going to be very brief about that. The proposed TTC measures also put a relatively heavy emphasis on governmental coordination bodies meeting at a very high frequency, as it is probably not necessary during times of normal market functioning. There too, we would ask for clarification on what is meant, how can the industry be included in those mechanisms, and how we can plan for changes ahead of time, build resilient structures and systems ahead of time. And then finally, too, on the level of the TTC, I think there is on a paper which I was recently made aware of, there's just 1-2 sentence paragraph at the end which addresses talent shortage, and we'd like to see more of that. We will again win this race through innovation and talent, and perhaps the TTC can do more to highlight this and ultimately address it. Finally, very briefly, where we as the German industry see 3 points where we can see with more collaboration, enhanced cooperation, how we can succeed across the Atlantic together with our friends from the United States. Standardization is an important topic, also a separate track within the Transatlantic Business Initiative. Globally harmonized standardization systems are vital for all the members. And it's important that those are open and not driven out of certain countries with the idea of closing economic systems or influencing global standards out of national interest. So standardization would be number one. Second point has already been mentioned at the first panel this morning, ensuring equal market access coordination of export control measures, for example, and if export control measures are implemented, use them strategically like a scalpel and not broadly, only in areas where national security interests are really affected, products which affect critical areas, and not broadly. And so I'd like to conclude my part now. Semiconductors, both the introduction as well as the discussion in a sense. I'd like to encourage this discussion to go forward. Semiconductors do play a foundational role. We urge all the participants in the TTC discussions, as well as on the European and American level, to look beyond this short-term impact of the supply-demand imbalance, appreciate the long-term strategic importance of semiconductors, of different semiconductors, and of the ecosystems, locally unique ecosystems, which they support in Europe and in the US. We can succeed together through innovation, shared values, appreciating differences, and strengthening the respective strengths. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Jakob Greiner and Ivo Wollmann. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for listening. And over now to a more interactive part in data policy.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andreas Schumacher. And first of all, again, also from my side, a very warm welcome to Ivo Wollmann. It's good to see you again. Those who live or work in Brussels know definitely Ivo, and let me say it's not an understatement that I believe you are the essential mastermind behind a lot of what we have seen coming out of the European Commission's workbench when it comes to the digital and the data policy that has been proposed and the whole data strategy of the past 2 years. And I would like to, of course, also, Ivo, then give you a chance if you want to react to the semiconductors discussion, but maybe just jump right in to the data topic, because for the TBI initiative, and if you've seen our recommendations, there's a lot that is very similar actually to what the Commission has been cooking up in the past couple of months, which I think is already a very positive sign that the industry is not completely unhappy with what came out of the European Commission. And of course, what is our interest is also to look at this from a joint transatlantic policy view and to see whether there's a room, if we're talking about such an essential topic as data, whether you can in a way unite forces, regulation, ideas to create not only a, let's say, a silo data policy for Europe, but also to accelerate that across the Atlantic. And if I just want to frame that within 1-2 minutes, what our recommendations were, essentially it was 3 things. One, concentrating on privacy, and we are very well aware that privacy is a different angle that is not subject to the TTC, but nevertheless, it's something that all industry is very, very concerned, negative, positive about. We said, try to work on a common privacy framework beyond Europe, Canada, US, and don't do this with kind of a race to the bottom or the lowest denominator, but build on what we have already established in the market, and the so-called gold standard, the GDPR, is surely something to work with. And the second point was specifically to other legislation that is right now also tackled in the proposed Data Act from the European Commission that could allow access to data in Europe. And there we have a feeling we still have, between the US and the EU especially, some jurisdictions or laws that are actually in conflict with each other. And I'm talking about the US Cloud Act and the GDPR. And it is our wish, of course, that the Commission continues to negotiate and to work on something that kind of marries and unites these, at the moment, conflicting laws. The second point is platforms. And the DSA, the DMA have been already mentioned. The DMA surely is a landmark file in the area of how to solve competition issues. And we are very pleased to see also in the TTC that actually both the topic of how to handle illegal content, but also how to progress on competition policy is something that both sides want to work on. Maybe not in the short notice in terms of DMA and competition in the long run, but there is, let's say, a chance for a common ground. Industrial platforms is something where we see Europe, in a way, taking the lead. And this would then maybe also a question that I would ask to you, Ivo, in terms of data sharing, data spaces, how can we incentivize industry to share data? The Commission has come up with a very bold legislation now where we do not have such a view on the US side, and it would be interesting for us to understand, is on the US side a similar initiative there, or is that something where you believe, again, we can set, so to say, a standard on what basis the industrial data should be shared, and maybe also going beyond just Europe? And the last point, and that's exactly going in that direction, data sharing. We believe there needs to be a holistic approach taken to data. As I said, a common data policy, not working in silos. Take the example of AI, artificial intelligence, which is very, very crucial and one element of the discussions. We see more and more that the big music of these regulatory approaches is being played outside of the legislation in standardization and standard setting. And I would say it is also of the interest of industry that we're not reaching to some form of a decoupling of standards, but to approach these files again with a common denominator and a common understanding based, of course, on shared values between the US and the EU. And so that's the TBI recommendations to the Commission. I believe there's not so much completely new to your ears. And I would say my three questions, they all link to the overall message. The message is create as much convergence as possible on regulation. Question to you, we have seen some friction, let's call it like this, when it came to the discussion of the Digital Markets Act, and we had representatives from the US side, let me say, not always perfectly amused about the ideas being discussed, but now we see within the TTC negotiations this common ground, and whether it's in the long or short run, I would be interested to understand from you, do you see that there's a possibility to, let's say, bridge the gap, if there is any gap, and whether the discussions now been taken in the past 18 months on the DMA side is something that can be a basis of further dialogue. Second question, on industrial data, I already mentioned it. The EU is coming out with this Data Act proposal. Is that something where you would see a common ground also for discussions and to reach some form of a global data policy idea? And the last one is more a pledge from the industry side. It has been said before. I think there's a lot of appreciation of industry input. This is also what we want to contribute to with this initiative. But we would, of course, always see a room of improvement. And it would be our pledge to you, also to the European Commission, to get the industry really as integrated as possible in this process, because we are all supporting the cause. We support the transatlantic partnership, and that there are so many topics on the agenda, as we just discussed, that we believe have a common ground of a basis of discussions. And now I'll leave it with this and give the floor to you, Ivo.
Yeah, many thanks, Andreas, and many thanks, Jakob, also for your kind introduction. And yes, we do listen to the stakeholders. Definitely, you've seen it also in the proposal for a Data Act. Now, just a general consideration first. So, data is very high on the political agenda at the moment. It has not always been the case, and there's very good reasons for that, because data can help us to live longer and healthier lives, to deal more efficiently with energy. It's the basis for innovation, for all kinds of innovation, and it's also increasing the efficiency of companies across the board, across continents, I would also say. Now, Europe and the US are sharing common values, open and free democracy, open and fair markets, that are, of course, the basis also for the TTC discussion. But let me first say a few words of where we come from with the data strategy that was brought out in 2020. There we basically had a vision with 4 key elements. The first one is that data should be flowing across borders in the EU and across sectors. Second, there should be ample of data available for use. Third, data use should be done in full respect with European values and our legislation. And fourth, there should be clear rules on access and use of data across the board. And that's the agenda that we're actually working from. Now, sometimes there's a misunderstanding about what we're trying to do with our data strategy. I was asked when we brought it out, so against whom is this data strategy? Is it against the Chinese, against the... Well, that's the wrong question. The data strategy is about how we want to do data in Europe, right? And Europe is open for business, but we would like our values and our legislation to be respected. If the data travels outside Europe, then the protection should travel with the data. So this is really important. Now, one misunderstanding I would like to tackle head on is that we are creating localization requirements. If you look at the Data Act, there is no localization requirements, and I've heard it several times, also from the US side, that we are creating localization requirements. That's simply not true. I'm happy to discuss this with anyone. Now, on the privacy question, there is an agreement in principle between President Biden and President von der Leyen on a new privacy shield, really important. Now, there's further discussions ongoing on the details. And of course, that's also tackling the issues that were raised by the Court of Justice in the Schrems 2 case, and that needed to be handled. Now, data has not been so much at the forefront of the TTC discussions. They have been linked to the platform discussion, and perhaps the reason for that is also that there is still the privacy discussion ongoing that is done in a different framework that should not be part of the TTC discussion. But your question, do you see there is a way to bridge the gap? Do you see a possibility for that? Definitely. What can we do more on data and discussion? Well, we can stress the commonalities on open government data. We are very, very close. But I would also see things like empowerment of users, of connected objects, for example, is a very important topic where we could look at things together. Now, that brings me to your question on the Data Act. What we're doing there, we are not forcing data sharing. What we're doing is basically replying in a fundamental way to the question, who can do what with data when the data is co-generated, right? So that is the issue that we're tackling. When you buy a connected object, do you know what you have as rights over the data? When you buy a connected car or a connected fridge, well, probably you don't, because things are simply not clear at the moment. And that is what we're trying to solve with the Data Act. That is the issue. So it's not about forced data sharing. It's about clarifying a situation that is leading to a lot of problems. And we've seen that over the last years. Now, I think this is a topic, the user empowerment, both business users and individuals, where we could look together to actually see whether we come from the same basic principles and whether we can move forward on that. Looking at the time, I think I probably should leave it at this. Once more, we are very happy that we got the industry input that we got on the Data Act. You know that there are discussions ongoing also in the aftermath of the publication of the Data Act, and we are very happy to engage on the data-related topics and to make sure that there is more convergence, as you say.
Microphone.
Thank you. Thank you, Ivo, and thank you, Jakob, for also being available on short notice. Without further ado, I hand over to Dr. Carsten Rolle for his panel on energy and climate policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schumacher, and welcome to our next session, which is devoted to the energy and climate policy issues. And in fact, when it comes to energy and climate policy, we are facing a full agenda in every respect in these days and weeks. First of all, of course, we do have all the long-term challenges that we are facing in terms of Energiewende, the European Union has formulated a European Green Deal. So climate neutrality is clearly defined as a target for most of us, with strategies behind that. And also organization BDI has contributed to that on German ground to define what could be this pathway, this roadmap. How could that look like in technology-wise, and also when it comes to policy instruments? And second, obviously, since the 24th of February, we are facing all the difficulties with the Russian attack on Ukraine, all the challenges that has also energy and climate policy-wise in a very immediate way. So the Zeitenwende, as the Chancellor has mentioned it, has again turned our page and has brought up new issues on the table in terms of security of supply, but also on all terms of costs and prices that German industry is faced with, and European industries, of course. Now, obviously, most of these challenges are a lot easier if we work together, if cooperation is part of the solution, and that's why I'm so happy to have two experts in our panel from the US and from Europe that are extremely experienced and I think well chosen to have this dialogue really going. First of all, I'd like to welcome Mrs. Virginia Murray. Ms. Murray is the Minister Counselor for Economic Affairs at the US Embassy with an impressive CV, many stations around the globe, in Europe, Asia, Middle East, in Washington, of course. And among that, one was the Deputy Chief of Mission at the US Mission to the European Union. And you're, in every respect, I think, the right person to talk to. Not only language-wise, I think you speak so many European languages, from French, German, Arabic, but also when it comes to all the topics that keeping us busy. Second, I'm glad to have Mrs. Yvonne Kaiseler on our panel. Mrs. Kaiseler works for the European Commission and its DG Climate. Now, since the year 2000, before that, she worked in the industry as a consultant, and she brings with her a graduation as an environmental engineer, which is also, of course, for all the climate policy issues, quite a good experience to look at also from a technical point of view. Now, thanks for having both of you, and I'd like to kick it off really with the issue number one in these days that keeping us busy and worried and concerned, and that is obviously the Russian attack on the Ukraine. This has really changed in several respects the agenda, at least short term. And the question I'd like to raise to both of you is, what do you believe, to what extent and what respects does that change the climate policy agenda short term, and also midterm wise when it comes to price levels, to roadmaps that we've defined in the past month? Do you believe that this is mainly a short-term issue, or does that have further influence on our roadmaps to climate neutrality? And maybe, Virginia, you'd like to start.
I'd be delighted to, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak to the group today. I've welcomed the creation of the TBI and look forward to working together with partners to make this transatlantic relationship stronger. I think the easy answer to your question is that, yes, absolutely, both in the short term and in the midterm, this situation with Russia, if anything, it will help accelerate the transition and the commitment to a climate policy based on renewable energy and meeting our climate goals for 2050. I mean, what the invasion of Ukraine underscored is that peace, energy security, and climate change are all interconnected. And that underscores that message of how important it is to reduce fossil fuel use. When we looked at, and when we're looking at today, our vulnerabilities because of our reliance on these fossil fuels, it sort of it forces us to rededicate ourselves to finding those new forms of energy. So that's really the simple question, and a simple answer to your question, and it's that these ambitious climate neutrality goals are going to get a boost. And we need to look at the solutions that are in front of us, across the range, whether it's solar, wind, geothermal, hydro, nuclear, et cetera. But with this audience that we have here today, I want to remind what a central tenet of US thinking is in this context, and that this isn't something simply for governments. When our special presidential envoy for climate, John Kerry, took on his role, he made engagement with industry as high a priority as government engagement. And he regularly meets with CEOs. And so we're welcoming the efforts that corporations can take to ensure that those net zero commitments are credible and are embraced and are accelerated. And we recognize that it's companies that are going to be feeling in the immediate term and in the midterm the impact of this effort, certainly in Germany and in the rest of Europe, to diversify away from the fossil fuels. So we welcome that commitment and we want to work with you on it.
Just one more question on that issue. I mean, on the one hand side, of course, the US, Canada, with all the LNG potential, are part of the solution of the immediate reaction now to reduce dependencies from Russia in terms of gas. But is there also a direct effect of the crisis on the US agenda and the US climate policy agenda? Are there discussions to speed up some of the instruments, or does that not have yet a strong influence?
I think it will absolutely speed it up, and we had already seen that commitment. You have the Department of Energy pushing forward with their hydrogen shot, right? And so we had in March, we had our Deputy Secretary of Energy in Berlin for the Berlin Energy Transition Dialogue, where these topics were at the forefront of the conversations. We brought together Ministry of Economy, Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials, and along with CEOs to talk about how you not only accelerate the LNG adaptation here, but then move to the next steps of using hydrogen and others. And what we were trying to do was to hear what are the roadblocks in the way that government puts in place that might keep that from happening more quickly. And so what is it we can do to facilitate an even faster transition?
Thank you. Now turn it over and hand it over to Mrs. Keisler on this side of the Atlantic. What's your view? Does the crisis, does the Russian attack speed up the European Green Deal, or is that an additional challenge on the way we want to transform our economies and reduce the influence of fossil fuels? What do you believe? What is the way we discuss that in Brussels?
Yes, thank you very much for having me, and it's always good to talk with people working on business matters. I totally agree with Mrs. Murray that this crisis not only, it's a wake-up call, again a wake-up call for us on the importance and the interlinkage of climate change and energy policies to move forward. So it will accelerate. It will have to accelerate. The crisis will have to accelerate our already commitments on climate change. Let me just go a little bit backwards in terms of policy. Basically, as you have mentioned before, we have the Green Deal communication since 2019. It's one of the top priorities in the European Commission. One of the 6 main priorities in the European Commission is the Green Deal. That remains so. The Green Deal has proven its agility and pertinence in the situation of crisis. First, the crisis of COVID, and then the second crisis, energy prices increase that were already there, and third, the aggravation of this energy crisis with the war in Ukraine. So the Green Deal continues to be our guiding march, and it remains a solution to the challenge we face, that we truly believe. The EU objectives on climate change, as mentioned, we have a midterm objective of a very strong reduction of emissions by 2030, at least 55%, and then climate neutrality by 2050. And this, in the case of the EU, is cast in law. So we have a climate law. So there was first the vision coming from the Green Deal, but it was incorporated in law. And we are now discussing the Fit for 55 package, which is a package of legislative and non-legislative measures to deliver on these pledges. The at least minus 55% reduction of greenhouse gases by 2030. So it's cast in law. What Ukraine brought us, the war, was the Repower EU. As you know, we have this strategy that was published in March 2022 with a very short and long-term solutions for the energy situation. And what we want is affordable, secure, and sustainable energy. This strategy builds on the Green Deal because it picks up again issues that were already in the Green Deal and in the climate law, notably renewable energies, increased renewable production, and energy efficiency. So these are two aspects that were already there from the beginning and now are even more important in the case of Repower EU. Of course, we will have. We are taking urgent action on pricing, issues of refilling the gas storage. This is more short term, but more in the longer term. What we want is to cut the dependencies from Russia, and here there are several pillars, as I mentioned: more renewable production, more solar, more wind, more heat pumps. How can we, as governments, make sure that the technologies that are there are accelerated and deployed, notably questions of permitting? How do we facilitate permitting of these technologies? Hydrogen accelerator, energy efficiency, diversity of supplies, and so on. So definitely, in a path that was already more or less set, the Repower EU and the crisis just will bunch us further. Thank you.
Absolutely. And if I may add or highlight at least one of the achievements of the European Union in overcoming crises as the one that we are facing these days, is that an integrated gas market in these days obviously helps a lot countries that are fully dependent from Russia to overcome these situations that might come in the next weeks or month. Now, let's turn a little bit to the further fields of cooperation for the two sides of the Atlantic that we want to address with the Transatlantic Business Initiative, with the TBI initiative that has worked already for the last month on proposals for cooperation, as we've called it. And maybe for those of you who are not that familiar with those, we see on the one hand side, I think the whole cluster of questions around carbon pricing and carbon clubs, as they're discussed in the European Union, as one pillar for further exchange that is really worth digging deeper into. As of course, this could be a field for further cooperation, but it needs also the exchange. Probably, what do we really mean by carbon pricing? What instruments are linked to that? What is the joint understanding? What are conditions under which these pathways, these roadmaps that we're also discussing in the G7 in these days under German presidency, how could they look like? Another field for further cooperation in several respects is probably the big future of a hydrogen economy. We strongly believe that hydrogen will come up as a global market and as the future fuel that we will need next to all the electrification. And obviously, there are technology leaders on both sides of the Atlantic. There's huge potential to produce hydrogen also in Canada and the US. There's the need to import green hydrogen in the future for several European countries, including Germany, for instance. So this is another very interesting field. What do we mean by green hydrogen? What are the definitions and norms we want to work on? And as a third pillar, I'd like to mention an exchange of experience. An exchange of experience when it comes to policy instruments that have proven to work well in Europe, in the United States, in Canada. What can we learn from each other? I think there's a lot when it comes to subsidy schemes, when it comes to quota norms, all of that we've tried out in the past years to get a better feeling and learn from each other. So maybe by having said that, I'd like to turn to the carbon pricing issue, which is obviously one of the most difficult topics that we have tried to address under G7, G20, and I think which is something or one of the preconditions for further progress in terms of climate neutrality and achieving it in the next decade. Maybe, Ms. Murray, we all know that this discussion is quite a sensitive one in Northern America, but what do you believe, what could be preconditions on which this discussion could be carried out further? Sorry, you're muted so far.
Sorry, excuse me.
Thank you.
I think it's a great question, and it's a good place to remind ourselves of what the TTC is designed to do. Or, you know, one of its pillars is to set the norms and standards for emerging technologies, and there are other elements under which we can have these kinds of conversations. As our special envoy has said, we're interested in any and every effort that will accelerate the reduction of the carbon problem. And there are other places. There's a major economies forum that was announced at the last COP that brings together the countries that represent 80% of global emissions. And this, you know, whether it's a carbon tax or a carbon border adjustment mechanism, it's a legitimate idea to have on the table, but we need to look at how it's implemented. And some of what has constrained the US in the past is the legal ability of Congress or the regulations to decide for states what can happen. But there are states themselves which have taken moves in this direction, like California and some of those on the East. So that's a place in which there is some constraint, but with sort of forward movement by first movers, you can have a positive impact. And in that first movers element, I do want to flag that at one of the things that we announced at the last COP as well was something called a First Movers Coalition. And it's designed to get carbon intensive industries to take the lead in decarbonizing their industries. So it's less of imposing a tax, but providing the incentive for companies themselves to take it. It leverages the purchasing power of companies to send a demand signal to scale up critical technologies that will lead to that net zero place. And, you know, starting with steel, shipping, aviation, moving to aluminum, cement, chemicals, and others, you have industry take the lead to make the transition and make the most carbon intensive industries less carbon intensive, and so reduce that need for the tax piece. And then in the supply chain, it becomes more attractive to use those base materials, and so it sort of builds this sort of virtuous cycle all along. And that's one other way that we hope to address this.
If I may test one idea that we're discussing also in the European Union, as I understood, explicit price signals are somehow sensitive, and you're mentioning the branch idea of going ahead in different branches by subsidy schemes, but maybe also by technology quota for green products. This is one of the ideas, at least some of the branches, the energy-intensive branches, do discuss in Europe, whether it is quotas that these branches define themselves, whether they're policy-driven. Could that be a pathway that is easier to follow, having these implicit incentives to get along with the signals that the market needs, as long as green hydrogen and electricity are more expensive than the fossil fuels? Sorry again, please unmute.
My apologies. That could be part of it. But again, with this First Movers Coalition, we've already got 40 large companies signed up to it. So they are already taking those steps. And it includes German as well as US firms and those from other parts of the world as well. So, I think you're going to need a combination of approaches. There is no one silver bullet that will lead us down the path, but we'll have to, piece them all together to make the movement that we can.
Ms. Keisler, if you listen to Ms. Murray, is that the level playing field already the European Union does expect? Is that the step we need for further discussions, and how's the way the European Union, the European Commission is discussing carbon clubs as an idea to step forward?
Let me just thank you for the question. Let me just come back to the carbon pricing. To be clear, for the European Commission, it's a very effective way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We have very long experience on implementing the emission trading scheme. We have demonstrated that by implementing this scheme in carbon intensive, energy intensive sectors, we have reduced emissions by 43% in these sectors. So the impact is there, very clear, and not only that, but we have promoted innovation. So it's a trigger of innovation and a trigger of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We collaborate with many countries around the world on fostering a global uptake of carbon pricing policies, and we come with our experience, how it worked, how did we do it, what were the effects, and we find that at global level there is now a movement of increasing the uptake of this type of methodology to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Cooperation with other countries, yes, for sure. We collaborate, as I mentioned. The only important thing for us is that this collaboration, when we talk about club, it has to be WTO compatible, follow the WTO rules. It has to be inclusive. It has to foster cooperation with major emitters, not only in G7, but outside of the G7. And we would like to promote synergies and avoid duplications of different process. So definitely cooperation with the US in other areas is very advanced. Not only TTC, but EU high-level climate club, action group, the EU Energy Council, that are taken at very high level and have proved to be effective way of deploying and giving the right signals to the industry, not only on production but also use of renewables. Notably, there is a clear signal on hydrogen, for instance.
Yeah, for the last few minutes, in fact, I'd like to briefly touch at least the interesting issue of green hydrogen, which is also part of the TBI agenda for further exchange. Maybe you can at least give a very brief note of what do you expect, to what extent are we really successful and will we be successful in bringing up green hydrogen markets, transatlantic green hydrogen markets up to 2030? And to what extent does the actual crisis maybe speed up all the attempts to achieve this? Mrs. Keisler, do you want to start this time?
Yes, so very shortly, I mean, we have a full strategy of hydrogen already since July 2020. It's our strategy. There are definitions there. It's our roadmap for 2030 on how we would deploy large scale, not only production, but use use of hydrogen. We need technology. We need changes in the production processes. So a production process of steel would use hydrogen instead of gas. So there is a lot to do. There is a path. We have an European Clean Hydrogen Alliance that brings together the industry, the financiers, and so on. And we are convinced we are in the good path. And of course, now with the crisis with Ukraine, we realize that not only we will produce hydrogen in Europe, increase the production of hydrogen, but also import from third countries.
Right. A brief one from Ms. Murray as well.
It will take some time. It will take some time, and it will take technology and innovation.
Yeah.
Great. I mentioned earlier the Department of Energy's hydrogen shot, and that's looking to reduce the cost to produce clean hydrogen by 80%. To $1 per kilo within a decade. So not quite 2030, but within a decade. And that is part of what we hope will unlock this ability for companies to take it on. In terms of working transatlantically, let me speak from my perch here in Berlin. When former Chancellor Merkel went to Washington last summer, she and President Biden launched a climate and energy partnership. And that partnership has 4 working groups, one of which is devoted to hydrogen. So that is a channel, another channel through which we can work jointly to share research, to share standards, to accelerate the uptake of this technology, and to do it jointly so we're less in competition, but doing it together.
Thank you so much, both of you, Ms. Murray and Ms. Keisler. I think what has been quite clear, there's so much room for further cooperation, for further exchange with all the experience on both sides of the Atlantic to really come to joint solutions. And by that, I'd like to hand it over to Tobias Vogel, who's moderating, I think, the next session. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Rolle. And a very warm and sunny welcome from the city of Munich. So my name is Tobias Vogel. I'm a member of the management board of UBS in Europe. So now we would like to focus on business and finance. And I can tell you, I've just come from a big family office conference in Munich. There's a lot going on in financial markets at the moment, but I clearly don't want to talk about what to buy in falling markets. Here, the focus really is on how can we work closer together across the Atlantic. Now, it's very obvious that a fully fledged trade deal across the Atlantic is very unlikely. However, there's a lot going on in specific fora, in specific sectors, and therefore that more likely will pave the way for closer cooperation between the EU and the US. Now, we would like to use today's event to give some food for thought, particularly ahead of the next EU-US meeting for the Trading Technology Council that will take place in France next week. Now, the TTC is clearly more focused on trade technology and security, whilst financial services are taken care of in the EU-US Regulatory Financial Forum. And that forum meets twice a year, comprising of senior policymakers and regulatory and supervisory people from across the US and the EU. And we have 2 of those people today on the panel, and I'm delighted that we have Paulina Damac-Hack from the European Commission and Mats Swinehart from the US Treasury. Now, Paulina is a Director of General Affairs in the Directorate General for Financial Stability and the Directorate General for Financial Services and Capital Markets Union. And Matt Swinehart is actually the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Financial Markets at the US Treasury. So Paulina and Matt, I'm delighted to have you on. And I would like to switch to my first question, if I may. And here the focus very much is on sustainable finance. And this is a topic which is very, very high on investors' minds, but it's also very, very high on the EU and US agenda. So the most obvious question that I have, where do you see most room for joint approach, but also where do you see most potential divergence? Paulina, perhaps if you could start.
Thank you very much, Tobias, and good morning, good afternoon, and delighted to join this panel. I think we are also adding on quite nicely from the subject of the previous channel, although we now move into the financial space. I want to start, and I'm sure that this comment has been made many times today during the conference already, but I will also say that of course we are extremely happy with the very good and very close cooperation with our American partners in the context of the rather horrifying Russian war against Ukraine, and of course on sanctions and other issues we have been very, very well aligned, and I think that's something which is extremely useful. I think we're working very well on sustainable finance together also. Tobias, you mentioned the regulatory dialogue, the bi-yearly exchange that we are having, which I think is very, very useful. And over the last years, we have also been focusing quite a lot on sustainable finance for the simple reason that the climate urgency is there. We need to move, we need to transition away from where we are today to the net zero situation. Public money will be needed for that, but even more importantly, we need a lot of private funding, and that's why the whole sustainable finance debate has become so important. I think, as you said, for the US, for the European Union, but also more internationally. We see that, for example, in the G20 working group on sustainable finance, which is chaired by the US and China. Now, in terms of what are the main issues here, the way we in Europe have built our agenda here is around 3 building blocks: the taxonomy, disclosures, and green label and products. That's, by the way, work that we started already a couple of years ago, I think a little bit earlier maybe than some others. We had a first action plan in this area back in 2018. Now, I think if we look at what is similar, where do we maybe take slightly different approaches. I think first of all, the good news is that I think the objective in the EU and the US is exactly the same. We need to deal with this climate emergency in which we find ourselves. We need to move towards the net zero. Now, I think the instruments, how we go about it, there of course we may make slightly different choices. In the EU, we believe that taxonomy is a really useful tool. It's a voluntary tool. It's basically a common grammar, if you wish, for investors, so they know how they can channel funding into sustainable projects. Matt and I have discussed that a lot, and I think that it's fair to say that the US maybe takes a slightly different approach on this. I think what's important is that we aim to have as much international, if not complete alignment and coherence, at least having as much interoperability as possible. I think that's important because we have a climate emergency. It's also important because obviously for businesses, for banks and everyone else, it makes sense that the rules are as similar as possible. So I think we're spending a lot of time on that, trying to discuss in various international fora how we can be as interoperable as possible. So that is one point. And then the second point briefly also is disclosures. There, of course, we are following with a lot of interest what the Securities Exchange Commission is doing in the US. Also here, I think we have come relatively far in Europe. We have our Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is about to come into place. It's making its way through the EU legislative process. We already have let's say, sustainability reporting rules in place, but we are reinforcing them further. I think this is absolutely crucial, and this is an area where, by the way, I see quite a lot of alignment, if you wish, also internationally. I think that's absolutely crucial if we really want to move towards a more sustainable future. We need to deal with greenwashing. We need to make sure that investors really know what their money is being spent on, and they're of course having very comprehensive and very rather granular financial reporting rules are so important. I think I will stop there as far as my kind of first intervention is concerned. Thank you, Tobias.
Toby, would you like me to come in?
Yes, Matt, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me? Great.
Perfect. Yes. Please
Okay.
go ahead.
Well, thank you to TBI, and it's an honor to be with you today and to share a virtual panel with my colleague Paulina and Toby I think in a testament to the close cooperation that we've had with Paulina's team and the Commission over the years, her remarks are very similar to my own. So I could simply point to them, I think, and you would have a good grasp. But let me just emphasize a couple of points. One is that we do share the same objective when it comes to sustainable finance and climate in particular. And we also have the shared objective of internationally increasing interoperability. For us, interoperability means an outcomes-based approach where we are not focused necessarily on aligning rule sets, although shared standards can be important in certain areas, and I'll touch upon that. But in areas where there is divergence, looking to ways that we can agree that our outcomes are very similar and comparable and consistent across borders. I think for us, we have similar buckets of work in this area. One is on disclosure, the other is on risk management, perhaps from a prudential perspective, and then the other is in the area of climate-aligned investing, of which taxonomies and labels are a part. So maybe two observations here. One, there are maybe areas like disclosure where there will be an international standard that can provide a global baseline. We think that's a very critical starting point. We're also working at the FSB to understand approaches to climate-related risk management from a prudential perspective, with the aim of continuing discussions to avoid unintended divergence in that area. And a second, at the same time, we recognize that at least in some areas, there will be a variety of approaches. So we're working with our EU and other colleagues, as I said, on interoperability. But I think we have very close cooperation bilaterally and as well as in multilateral forums.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Much appreciated. It was very, very clear from both of your introductions that I think we are on the same page between the US and the EU when it comes to the objective. And I think where we want to get to, I think is very, very clear on both sides of the Atlantic. But Matt, you also mentioned that you are more focused on outcomes, so it's more outcome-based approach, whilst the EU might be a little bit more rule-based. So the question is to both of you, how do we make sure that we get on a common ground so that we reach the same objective in a most efficient way?
Well, I mean, I think that, first of all, to say that it's probably true, it's probably a fair observation that the EU is quite rule-based. I think that is part of the way the EU system is set up. It's also, I think, a bit of a necessity. If you have 27 kind of systems coming together and you need to basically have a framework which is quite clear, which is quite precise, so that everyone knows what to do. It's probably a little bit different if you are a kind of single jurisdiction. That, of course, is a situation for some of our, or many of our international partners. Now, I mean, I think that the key in this area, as in so many others, is really to have these international discussions and these international dialogues and debates. And I think Matt mentioned very rightly also the ongoing work in the Financial Stability Board. I think we should bear in mind also that here, for obvious reasons, we are focusing on the EU and the US, but of course there are also other jurisdictions. Of course, we have our international partners in the G7, but also importantly, if we look at the emerging economies, we are working a lot also as part of our global gateway with our international partners in Africa, in some Asian countries, etc. So I think we need to bear in mind that, of course, we have the EU-US dialogue and work on this, but we have to remember that there are climate challenges and urgencies for the rest of the world as well. So for me, the one answer to your question is basically we really need to continue to have these very close discussions and dialogues. I personally think that having a degree of common standards is really important. But of course, when there are different ways of reaching the same objectives, by all means, let's then try to do things in different ways, but end up in the same place.
Thank you. And I think both of you mentioned a number of times the importance of having a common international standard. So perhaps, Matt, a question to you. The IFRS Foundation set up an International Sustainability Standards Board more recently in Frankfurt. So how do you see the chances that an acceptable international standards from a reporting perspective will be found?
Well, congratulations to Frankfurt on becoming the home of an ISSB office. We think that's a great news. And I think I would say a couple of things here. One, as you'll see as you have seen in the SEC's proposed rulemaking, it's built on and inspired by the TCFD, as is the efforts at the ISSB. So we expect a high degree of alignment between the two. That's good news, I think, for everyone. We do think that the ISSB is the right place to establish a baseline global sustainability reporting standard. And our ultimate objective, is for consistent, comparable, and decision-useful climate-related disclosures for investors. And as I mentioned, we do think that standards are very important, and I'm optimistic that we will achieve one there. But additional work is also needed to help ensure that jurisdictions are implementing those standards and that choices in how those standards are implemented in different jurisdictions still maintain interoperability and don't result in market fragmentation. So to Paulina's point, bilateral cooperation at the US-EU forum, as well as in other bilateral forums, very important together with some of these multilateral efforts that we're talking about. And because it is more than a two-jurisdiction issue, we really do emphasize the importance of efforts like FSB and IOSCO, where they will be working to encourage implementation within their respective mandates. And we also intend to use our co-chair role at the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group to assess progress of international work generally, and as part of that to promote consistent and comparable reporting.
Thank you, Matt. And Paulina, may I ask, how quickly do you think we will manage to embark on a common set of international standards?
Well, I think in the disclosure space, if we kind of stay there for a short moment, and in a way we are making your life easy or difficult, Toby, because we are agreeing so much with each other. I think what Matt was saying in terms of the ISSB being a global baseline, I mean, this has been the way the EU has been looking at this from the very beginning. As I mentioned earlier, I think we have in the disclosure area probably gone a little bit faster maybe than some other jurisdictions. We have already sustainability reporting rules in place. We are, as I mentioned, actually reinforcing them as we speak. We are, I hope, quite soon now at an agreement between our two co-legislators for our corporate sustainability reporting directive. I think the coherence here with the ISSB will be very important. We will probably be a little bit more granular, go a little bit further and faster in certain areas. But having this kind of baseline, I think, is important. To ensure that that's really the case, we also have a very close cooperation between our European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, the so-called EFRAG, which cooperates very well with the IFRS Foundation and now, of course, also with the ISSB. So I think that for me, I think the challenge here is really to have this kind of global baseline, if you wish, but of course, accepting the fact that some jurisdictions will want to do things, go a little bit further, be a little bit more granular maybe. But I would be relatively optimistic that this will, in the disclosure field at least, that could work relatively well.
Yeah. And Paulina, you provided a nice segue into when you mentioned, in a way, the two of you make it fairly easy for me. So let's focus on making it a little bit more difficult. So which are the areas where you feel we will not reach a common ground? Where are the biggest differences, and where do you think that may hold us back from basically coming to a joint framework and joint standards? Perhaps I'll ask you first again, Paulina, and then I hand over to Matt.
Well, I think we should focus on what we can achieve and what we are aligned maybe more than things where we are a little bit less aligned. I think one also needs to recognize that different countries, different jurisdictions come with different traditions, different existing frameworks, and that I think is something that we need to take into account. I think the area I mentioned before, but I don't want to put words in the mouth of Matt, is that I think on the taxonomy, it would seem to me that maybe we take a kind of slightly different approach in Europe compared to the US. We have, as you know, taken this decision because we already have our framework in place, and we are it evolves, we are developing it further with various implementing rules covering more activities, for example, in the taxonomy. And we think that is the right way to go about things. Now, I mean, again, I'm not going to put words in the mouth of Matt, but it would seem to me that maybe the US will take a slightly different approach here. Again, that's maybe not so problematic if we just ensure that we have this interoperability between the systems, as we both have referred to already.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And if I would focus on what we can achieve together. I think if there is one area where we have identified together that there is already some divergence, that is in this question of taxonomies. It's not news that we do not have one. There are other jurisdictions that have made an affirmative decision not to have one. And so for that reason, understanding that there will be jurisdictions with and without these particular tools, having conversations around other ways that we can send common signals to the market that may achieve some of the same benefits that maybe the EU and others are hoping to achieve through a taxonomy. That includes work at the G20 on net zero commitments that have been made by financial institutions and providing a layer of accountability on those commitments. And some of the things that we're exploring in that group and others, if there are other metrics and other ways that we can work with the private sector to provide a greater degree of clarity as to how we as the government see the transition to net zero taking place over the next few years, decades.
Thank you.
Can I just come back very briefly on that? Because I think the issue, the common objectives here, the common challenges, I think are quite clear. I mean, I think you need a way to help investors, or at least give them incentive to kind of know what is sustainable investment. And then I guess there may be different ways of doing that. I think there's a common objective that we want to avoid greenwashing. That's really, really important. So from that point of view, I think if one looks at the kind of objectives, and then it's more a matter of what could be the different ways of achieving it. I think really important also, because now we have been talking more about the, let's say, the general frameworks. There is, of course, a lot of things that need to be done also at an entity basis. So basically, the transition plans of individual companies. We have proposed legislation in Europe that makes it mandatory for banks and insurance companies that they need to have their transition plan. They need to show how they integrate the climate objectives in their business model. And I think that's also part of this overall picture that we need to bear in mind here. Thanks.
Thanks, Paulina. I mean, you just talked about, well-established financial institutions like banks, insurance companies. If I look at the financial services industry, over the last few years, we have seen exponential growth in non-traditional business models, particularly in financial services when it comes to products, applications, platforms, and services. So the question that I have is, would you agree that financial regulation and supervision needs to focus on products and services rather than just entities? And do you think it will be possible that we have a level playing field between the traditional financial services providers and the more non-traditional, i.e. The newcomers? Matt, perhaps if you could start.
Yeah, of course. I think it's clear that it's critical to long-term economic growth that we harness the benefits of technological innovation. At the same time, we're very clear-eyed that with changes in technology and business model, that accompanies risks and new risks and different types of risks accompany that change. So I think our objectives here are to support technology neutral, principles-based, functions-based approaches. And that is, whether we're talking about cloud computing, AI, or new approaches to digital payments, although the approaches within each of these different buckets may be different. I think the FSB and international standard setting bodies have also emphasized the general need for international work that adheres to this principle that we call same activities, same risks, same rules. That's very easy to say in the abstract. But how that principle is implemented is really requires very considerate and detailed cooperation internationally. I think on your question, your component question about a level playing field is really top of mind for us right now. In last year, President Biden tasked the Treasury Department with writing a report that analyzes the entrance of new firms, including non-bank firms, into consumer-facing financial services and implications for competition and level playing field. So we're developing a report on that subject. It's something that is well underway, and we hope to publish it before the end of June. And at that point, I hope to have more to say about our sort of concrete positions and how we are thinking about this. But I think the bottom line is that we support responsible innovation because we know that new entrants and new technologies do have potential to serve as sources of increased efficiency and inclusion, but it's really imperative to us to analyze new entrants, new technologies, and to understand how their taking part in the market may affect questions of level playing field, and to ensure that what we had thought was a technology neutral framework in the past is truly technology neutral and fit for purpose for future application.
Perfect. Thank you, Matt. Paulina, I don't want to be rude, but unfortunately we have run out of time already, and I know we have been given a hard stop, so I would like to ask you perhaps to keep it very, very brief as your final remark on this level playing field topic, and then we probably have to close already, unfortunately.
Okay, I would try to be very brief. I think Matt made a lot of useful points already. I mean, first of all, of course, to state the obvious that yes, indeed, the whole world of finance is changing, exacerbated, by the way, also by the pandemic, where you see especially young retail investors going about investments very differently compared to what was the case in the past. So, of course, indeed, a lot of new products, a lot of new services, a lot of innovation, which is good. Of course, that comes with risks. I think that's important. At the end of the day, we need to make sure that we look at investor protection, that we look at consumer protection, that we have the right tools in place to fight money laundering and financial crime. Doesn't matter, what's the form, what's the medium. These rules still need to be there. We have proposed in the EU the so-called MiCA, which is basically a regulatory framework for crypto assets, because we foresee that the crypto assets are there. We think we need them to have a very adequate and appropriate regulatory framework. We are looking at operational digital resilience, all the cyber risks that financial institutions need to deal with. We have rules that are just being agreed on that as we speak. We are also, by the way, revising our payment service directive. We are looking at our retail investment precisely to make sure that our rules are fit for purpose. And of course, indeed, the level playing field here is very important. Banks and fintechs, big tech, of course, coming in more and more in this space also. So all something to be very mindful of. And we are really trying to make sure that our rules are fit for this new digital world. I will stop there. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Paulina and Matt, thank you very much for your valuable contributions and insights. I think it's great to see that we all have a common objective that we're working towards. The chance of setting international standards seem pretty high. And also your comments around the level playing field were very much appreciated. Clearly, from a TBI perspective, we would very much appreciate if we could continue the dialogue with the European Commission and the US Treasury on these topics, and if our proposals and views could be heard over the next few months. But with that, I would like to hand over to Professor Rustwurm for the closing remarks. Over to you, Professor Rustwurm.
Thank you. This is now really a challenging task to wrap up these 2 hours and these really in-depth discussions. I'll try it anyway and start with an addendum, Paulina, if I may. You said that we should focus on things where we are aligned, and this is very true in the sense of where we are aligned in intentions. And then hopefully we have a chance to get aligned in the formalities as well. This was for me the common theme throughout the last 2 hours. We had some side effects. We Europeans, the wonderful aspect that we have to tackle 27 jurisdictions within our common market is something that economy and businesses do emphasize again and again to our governments. Content-wise, I think the most used word during the last 2 hours was solutions. And solutions well beyond numbers. That's what I noted. Very true. And then the next frequent was trust. And I think these 2 hours were really exchanged in this atmosphere of trust. I do hope that you all found it time well spent, and especially for the delegates in the TTC process, I do hope that the comments from business were helpful for your work ahead. And this work ahead, that has been summarized with another German word that for me comes close to getting to know what Zeitenwende is, and this is dicke Bretter bohren. So really get the hard stuff done. And that's what we hope to help you. And we wish the delegates of the TTC process all the best in that. Thank you all for participating in this event. Thank you all for your contributions.